What ancient slave owners weren't allowed to do. The owner-slave relationship was the keystone of the law of slavery. In the ancient world, slavery was subject to various laws, but they were mostly drawn up in favor of owners rather than slaves. Very little was said about the rights of slaves. In many ancient societies, enslaved people had no personal rights. They were regarded as the property of their owners. They could be bought, sold, and mistreated at will. They were unable to own property, enter into a contract, or legally marry. The more owners controlled their slaves, the less the law was likely to say about it. Very often, owners could kill their slaves with impunity, but that wasn't the case in all societies. The right to kill one's slaves was restricted under the Principate. This was typical for the Hebrews, the Athenians, and the Romans. The Code of Justinian changed the slave's status from a thing to a person. It imposed death penalty for killing slaves by torture, poison, or fire. The Code of Justinian deprived cruel owners of their slaves. Slaves often had the right to take refuge in a temple. Some societies forbade owners to rape their female slaves. Byzantine law banned mistresses from sleeping with male slaves. It prescribed that the mistress was to be executed. The male slave was to be burned alive. Owners couldn't refuse to provide their slaves with food. It was prescribed in Judea in 200 BC, in Sicily in 135-32 BC, and on the Nile in 46 AD. Owners couldn't deny their slaves' right to buy their way out of slavery. Sometimes, slaves sold themselves into servitude. They could repay their debt over time. They could achieve freedom once a contract was complete. Slaves had advocates. Among Roman philosophers, Seneca urged slave owners to be kind and paternalistic. Epictetus was a former slave himself. He called for the fair treatment of slaves by masters. Epictetus found slaves to be noble. Slavery underpinned much of the Roman society's success. Free-born citizens were heavily dependent on slaves. They needed slaves for their world to operate effectively. It was in masters' interests to treat their slaves fairly. This resulted in a more productive workforce. Sometimes, slaves were granted some benefits. They could have a small allowance. Some slaves were permitted informal marriage pacts. They could even make wills. Some domestic slaves were educated or highly skilled. Such slaves were much sought after. Tutors for children, skilled cooks, and hairdressers could demand high prices. Some slaves developed close relationships with their masters. Their relationship was built on mutual respect. The famed politician Cicero and his personal secretary Tiro are an example. Cicero's family was genuinely attached to Tiro. Slaves could be appointed to high positions. They could be managers, bailiffs, debt collectors, and captains of merchant ships. Then, they could have a more independent life, but they could still be severely punished for inefficiency.